Janet Roche is a nationally recognized design practitioner, educator, and advocate specializing in trauma-informed design. Founder of Janet Roche Designs and CEO of the Trauma Informed Design Society, she co-authored Trauma Informed Design, a framework for architects, designers, and other practitioners. She teaches at Boston Architectural College and consults across education, healthcare, and housing sectors, helping create inclusive healing center spaces that foster safety and dignity for all. And Janet, feel free to elaborate on that. I know that's just a very brief snippet of your work.
I can't sometimes always keep up with my own bio. Every time I go and I look at my resume and stuff like that, I'm like, oh no, like there's a lot of things I need to put on it. But I think that was really yeah, I think that kind of sums it up. I mean, the podcast is the other one, so Inclusive Designers Podcast. I'm the host and producer of that as well
Awesome, awesome.
in my spare time. So.
Yeah. Awesome. So let's start with something personal. So before you became who you are today, who are you trying to be and what shaped that journey?
It did really, actually, it's funny. I was just talking about that earlier today. The So I went into college thinking that I had a clear path. I wanted to be a social worker for juvenile delinquents and then become a family defender for delinquents or juvenile offenders, I should probably say, and then eventually family court judge. That was sort of the lofty goal going forward. And I found that I got fairly burnt out pretty quickly at my job, and I was working in a locked facility for these male juveniles, and it just I wouldn't say it wasn't for me. It was just a lot. And, I'm in my early 20s and I had started off there as an intern and then became employed by them. And I mean, it was a profound experience, make no mistake. And anytime I went to a cocktail party, I had a lot of listeners just to talk about my experiences. But so then I took a little tour, if you will, and I ended up going back to school and I got sort of like mini MBA from the Harvard Extension School. And then I ended up owning my own production company. I met somebody through BU. They had like a little alumni social, and she was running her own production company. And so I did that for about 25 years. And at that point, like things were just changing in the industry quite a bit, and I was getting a little burnt out. And I really found myself desiring some sort of creative outlet. And running a company doesn't always allow you the opportunity to have those creative outlets. And so at some point, I thought I would kind of look into design. I've always been interested in it. I My mom actually used to have a whole bunch of architectural digests in the house. She wasn't a designer, but she just loved that stuff too. So I've been reading floor plans and looking at design since I was a little girl. My mother also used to have the big books out there that would say, baths, kitchens, right? And I can still see them in my head. And again, I would spend hours poring over them. I got, one of the reasons why I didn't go into it right off the bat, I think I got a little nervous because I was afraid of fractions, right? So I thought the fractions would be too much, right, when measuring and everything like that. And I didn't really think that I maybe necessarily had the chops for it, right? And because I didn't really understand the industry. And like I said, I had this plan, right? So it kind of really didn't mesh. And so there's fast forward. So I ended up at the Boston Architectural College, and I went into their interiors program, and they had a speaker there, and his name was Dak Kopak, and he was talking about designing for human health. And as soon as I heard it, I knew. I was like, that's what I want to do, right? Like, I'm not, I'm not I just knew it, right? And so by the way, I'm like 50 years old and I'm in the back of this auditorium trying to figure out how to get out of out of the mandatory meeting. And I'm like kind of like hitting the people that are next to me. I'm like, that's what I'm going to go do. And they could care less. They just wish that I had stopped hitting them, right? Like, because I didn't know them. And so, anyways, so with that, after I met Dak Kopak, and he was talking about design for people with visual acuity problems, design for people who have dementia, and the kind of the things ways that we can implement design in order to help people. It just rang true to me. So I went back to the BAC and I was like, how do I do that? They're like, well, there's going to be a program next year. We're starting it with Dr. Kopak, and we will be offering at the BAC called the Design for Human Health program. So I was the first cohort to go through that program. And during that time, I ended up I graduated from the program. I started teaching at the BAC actually a complete. I was handing in my thesis while I was handing in my syllabus, right? Like, it was a very stressful time, um, and uh, and then I started to get to know my thesis advisor, who's now the director of the DHH program at the BAC, Davis Hart. And we started talking. And then at that point, so during this transition period of time, I started talking to Carolyn Robbins. Carolyn Robbins is my co-producer. She was supposed to be here today. She sends her apologies. She was feeling under the weather. And I've always she's been a producer forever, and I knew her through my producing or my owning my production days. And I would always go to her and be like, I have an idea. And I would say to her, I have this idea and I think it's going to be great. And she would always tell me, she goes, well, listen, why don't you like go back and figure out what you're trying to do and then come back to me. And so once I started at the DHH program, I realized that, because I'm watching HGTV all the time, right? TLC, all these shows, and we just had Extreme Home Makeover that, focused really on people who had different types of maybe conditions in the home, or they've been through something traumatic, and they, would come in and they would do everything in 2 weeks, and poof, they had a new house, and people would be crying and everything like that. And I was like, well, why not produce a whole show about that? And so Carolyn came back to me. So I'm not even finished with school yet, by the way. And Carolyn came back to me instead of saying, when you've got it all figured out, you can come back to me and talk to me about it. She actually called me the next day and she goes, so I was thinking about it. And so we started coming up and formulating a plan and calling it inclusive designers. And so our hope and our thought was to really try to produce a show that would showcase what you can do with design within the built environment to help people and to live a healthier life, right? No matter what their circumstances are. And so we shopped it around a bit, and the word that kind of came back to us was is that it was too contrite, meaning they didn't want people crying on screen. This was going to be too much for them, and I knew that that was a bunch of baloney. Because I can even watch House Hunters and people cry at House Hunters. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, if you ever watch those shows, there's somebody's crying at least one out of the three shows. So we knew that that wasn't it. I think that people still have an issue with people of different abilities and disabilities and all that stuff. It still makes people nervous. And so I said to Carolyn, I said, why don't we start our own podcast? At least we can start that way. And so we grabbed the word inclusive designer and we trademarked it for podcasting. And we've been doing it now for 6 years. But meanwhile, though, so all that's going on, and now so meanwhile, all that's going on, um, Davis Hart, who's one of my co-founders for Trauma Informed Design Society, had brought up the word trauma informed design. And just like I did when I was in that auditorium, I just knew, right? Like having seen my background with these kids in a locked facility, my background as a social worker, right? Like it just all just kind of fell into place, and my desire and my need as a designer to help people within the built environment. So I really kind of leaned into that very quickly. And at some point, I went back to Davis and I was like, GoDaddy has we can buy the website traumainformeddesign.org for $2.99. Do you think we should like grab it? She's like, sure. And That was back in 2019. No, maybe that was 2020, but we had been talking about it since 2018. And it really wasn't until the pandemic that things, there was those 2 weeks in there, that last 2 weeks of March, that was just like there was nothing going on. And then April 1st, my phone couldn't stop ringing. And it was about designing, trauma informed design and designing for the trauma that everybody was experiencing going through the pandemic, right? And that includes things, and even the loneliness, and are we going to die, and what's going to happen to the economy, like all those stressors. And now I'm living with my family 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Like that's trauma too. And like how you know what I mean? Like how does that all work? And so meanwhile, right before the pandemic, I also am an adaptive sports instructor for people with all different types of abilities and whatnot, or kids. Usually, I like to work with kids, usually kids with um, delays and disabilities, and teaching them how to ski and get ready for the Special Olympics and everything like that. I've found such great joy in that, right? But they too had a like, you must go to this speaking, training piece. And again, trying to sit in the back, trying to figure out how to get out of it because now I'm 55 or 54 and I still haven't learned my lesson. And I met Christine Cowart, who's now one of the co-founders of Trauma Informed Design Society. So that was, and I went from like trying to figure out how to get out of this to like literally staying afterwards so I could start asking her a whole bunch of questions, and then following her out in the hallway, following her into the parking lot. And the poor woman, it was her first time speaking, and here's this zealot go coming after her. You know what I mean? She's probably like, "Oh, it's crazy lady." And I'm like, even like emailing her while I'm in the car because I knew like she had the knowledge of what trauma informed was in order for us to prepare for trauma informed care. I can only bring so much to the table, right? Like my education and everything like that, was such a long time ago. But I'm trying to tell her, I'm like, we can bring it to design. We can make it part of the overall design and, have it baked into the cake, just like sustainability. And again, I think she really thought I was out of my tree. But then we moved into the pandemic, and then we started talking more, and that's when then Davis and myself and Christine really kind of formulated the Trauma Informed Design Society. So that's
Wow.
sort of it in a nutshell. It's a little long-winded, but I'm also kind of I think what you were trying to ask, and I think it's important for your listeners to realize, like maybe you think you're taking a right turn or right or a left turn or whatever. Like so many different things happened, especially within the last 10 years, almost 12 years now. Um, where I thought I was going to be doing something, and I ended up in these other paths that I had never even imagined plus, and it also brought like my background into all of this, right? Brought the social work into it. Running the business was part of running the production company, right? Putting podcasts together was part of the production piece of it, right? So like it really, I'm a big advocate of explaining to people and telling people if you know what I mean? Like you just don't know what like life is going to bring you. And so I've been very, I haven't always been happy. Like I've had jobs, I've gotten fired from jobs, I've gotten, you know what I mean? Like there's been a lot of areas for improvement over the years, but I think it's important for people to realize that, you know, you can do other things. You can move into other areas and then take that information and knowledge because I knew when I started right out after the BAC and here I have my master's, I was going to push my own self. Like I wasn't going to go to a company because I knew I also had all these other experiences in my background to really kind of provide me with the expertise that I needed as opposed to needing to go to a firm or something like that. If I was 20 and if I had done that route when I was 20, I don't even think I would be here where I am today. I probably would find things like the Inclusive Designers podcast informative, and I would probably also think that the Trauma Informed Design Society would be something pretty cool, and I would probably want to get certified. But at the end of the day, I would not have ended up in that leadership role had I not gone through these other avenues for, what, almost 40, is that right? Oh, Jesus, almost 40 years. So there
Wow,
you go.
wow. That was the most thorough response I think I've ever received on a
I'm
on a
sorry.
first question, on a background
Well,
question.
but Amy, but
It is.
it's an important piece. It
It
really is.
is an important piece, and thank you for the very thorough response.
And it also shows you sort of where the passion comes from, right? Like what drives me.
Yeah, yes. Let's dig a little deeper into that. Can you share a moment in your life when you felt unseen or excluded, and how that experience continues to guide your work today?
That's a great question. It happens a lot, right? It happens as being a female. It happens being a female who has learning disabilities. It happens as a female who's getting older. Not being seen as I used to be when I was younger, but it was a different type of attention. I'm just going to throw that out there. But I do, and or if because you're a female, like you don't know. Like when I ran my production company, I was what? I started like at 28. And there were all these older, usually white men around me, kind of telling me that isn't, it's sort of like, isn't that cute? Like she's running her own production company. Do you know what I mean? Like, but we were paying the bills, we had offices, like, great. And I find that that's something that while it just helped to make me a stronger person and a more determined person to try to rise above that. But yeah, it happens a lot. And then in the work that I do, especially with both the podcast and the society, it is to make sure that people feel represented and heard and that they are, included into the conversation and included into the design as opposed to an afterthought. Sometimes I get designers, not so much anymore. Like when I first started out, I don't know, maybe because I yelled at them too many times, but it was how do I get around the ADA? How do I need to put in, fill in the blanks. And can you show me how I can get around ADA? And And again, I hope that one of the reasons why that they're not contacting me is because of the fact that I have yelled at them too many times. But I think though, the tide has changed a little bit, and even in just those short, like 11 years or so. But yeah, I, I think, you know, I think we maybe a lot of us have had that experience, obviously to varying degrees and for various reasons. But it's something that's usually quite painful.
Yeah, yeah, thank you for sharing that. So, what is part of your personal story, either your health, your background, your identity, that people don't necessarily know about, but that deeply informs the work you do? I know you gave a very thorough response
Robust.
to that first question. And so, if we already covered it, I am perfectly happy to skip it.
Well, I think, so I think the some of the genesis of even how like I was looking to start out my career was that my brother had always had all sorts of emotional issues when we were growing up, and it- I don't know what the diagnosis would be today. We would probably actually have a diagnosis today as opposed to the early 70s, through the early 80s. And but all of that, all I know that he felt a lot of anxiety. I mean, crippling anxiety. And again, it just wasn't addressed at that point. And then at some point, what kind of came through was drug addiction, drug and alcohol addiction. And, as a family, that tends to be very, you know, it lopsides the family. It becomes all about the individual with all the problems, all the issues. And I know that it part and parcel of my desire to get into justice for um, adolescents, right? And I always felt like even when I was in high school, like I was always battling for the underdog, right? Like I was always, what I mean? Like I was always on the front lines for anybody, anything that was sort of the underdog. And so I do think though like I said, part of the genesis was that family dynamic that really sent me down that justice route because I always felt like sometimes teenagers really didn't get heard. As a teenager, I felt like I also didn't always get heard. And So it was funny. In my high school yearbook, I had written, you put your little quotes in your high school yearbook or whatever. And mine said, my last quote or it was said something, you treat them like animals and they will respond as such. Treat them as decent human beings and or treat them with respect. I gotta go look it up. I made it up, but along those lines, right? So I think I've always had that element in me, and I just that's why I figured justice was a good portion of that, and understanding and having empathy for humans.
Yeah, yeah, and the next question is very much related. When did you first realize the world wasn't designed for everyone? How did that uh, realization land with you?
That's an interesting question, and I'll tell you, it goes back to working for the juvenile system here in Massachusetts. I'm dating myself a little bit here, but when we used to have, first of all, we never used the word trauma when we were talking about the residents. And we were still at the end of this era where it was called something called, oh my goodness, I'm blanking out on the name. Not Frank Talk. Jeez, what was it called? Scared Straight. There we go. Scared Straight. And Scared Straight was, about taking juveniles or young men into the prison system and then having the older gentleman scream at them because this, the poor young men haven't been through enough trauma. We now know like the amount of trauma, like this was not what I mean, absolutely not what they needed. And so, but I remember going through the prison system and just, it was one thing to be in the juvenile system there, you know what I mean? It was just a little softer, not a lot, but just a little bit. And but to go through the adult prison system, I just thought to myself, what in the world are we doing? Do you know what I mean? Like, but I wasn't really exactly putting it together. So as soon as I hit the Design for Human Health program, I couldn't unsee it, right? I couldn't unsee the injustice. And every day I'm walking around, I'm like, what are they thinking? Do you know what I mean? Like, there's definitely times when I actually go up to like the cash register, some poor person's just trying to get me my coffee or whatever it is, and I'm like, there's this thing over here which is not right, and it shouldn't be like that. And but it's definitely something where I see it a lot. But that first moment, I had more of a real aha moment at the BAC DHH program was all of a sudden we were starting to talk about like just even the smells and how that can affect people. And I was brought right back to the prison systems. And I remember thinking to myself, we need to change those. And part and parcel is we also know that recidivism rates are very high in the United States. It's something like 7 years, 79% go back at some point. We don't support them. We don't help them. We're just not. And so, sometimes your past really kind of helps to push along your present. But I feel like at this point in time, I don't want to say I'm trying to like not yell at the barista. Do you know what I mean? For what I see is egregious like design. Because they're like, I did not create this. Do you know what I mean? Would you like cinnamon in your coffee? Like that, and I get it, but somebody has to hear it. And I find that I see it all the time, whether I'm walking around the streets, whether I'm at hotels, whether I'm at the theater, I can also see there's been an improvement, a lot of improvement, but there's so much that still needs to happen within the built environment. I mean, it's just,
Yeah.
yeah, I'm sure, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, so.
Yeah, well, I definitely understand where you're coming from and going with this, and I think you're right. Being a manual wheelchair user, I definitely can relate to this point, and I'm curious to hear your response to the next question too, because it directly relates to what's relevant for people on this platform, right? People with mobility disabilities. What does true inclusion mean to you, and what have you learned about its true costs?
I mean, are you talking at like a financial cost? Because the financial costs are also like a
I think I'm
problem.
thinking more holistically. So, what does true inclusion mean to you, and what have you learned about what it really costs? And so, I think thinking about it more holistically.
Yeah. I mean, I think the cost I mean, listen, without like inclusion, without social interaction, without the ability to get to places, without being the ability to have like to be able to do the same thing as able people can do, or see or hear or what have you, it becomes a problem because it takes a toll on people's psyche, it takes a toll on people physically. And it takes a toll then ultimately it takes a toll on society as well. And sometimes it can be something temporary or it's also something it's permanent, but it can also be somebody who's aging, right? We're all becoming older. And as we all become older, we have, like mobility starts to change, right? Our eyesight starts to change. My hearing, I can assure you, is changing every day. And all of that. plays a factor. And I know I watched my 89-year-old dad. He has hearing issues, and he finds that the hearing aids that he has, and he's got top of the line hearing aids that down. Now there's some like app and like, you know what I mean? Like he can put it on restaurant mode and all this other stuff. And but it doesn't really work for him. And what happens is that like for him anyways, he's now becoming more introverted, and not participating as much into a conversation, right? And that starts to, you can start seeing the divide and start seeing where then he's not engaged, and he's more likely to, I don't think so because he's 89 at this point, but he could start to develop dementia as a result of that not being able to engage as much as he would like. So all these little things end up adding up and they become very problematic. And it's just, again, you talk about a holistic approach. I mean, so I've been trying to get an inclusive playground here, not too far from my house. And all the other issues aside, and but it's about I've explained to city officials multiple times that if you go and you create an inclusive playground, you're more likely to get everybody. Like, so that means grandparents, even if your parents then like say again, something temporary, or even if you're pregnant, right? Like it's just all of the stuff that just makes life easier. You're more likely to go to that playground than the playground that's not. You're more likely to go to the stores near that playground because it's closer to the playground. So economically, even like it does better for that part of the city than it does than to have your kind of old standard playground, which I think is kind of fascinating. And it needs to be sort of, that's another form that I think that needs to be amplified and and it's not just DEI and it's not just, this wokeness. It's about serving a whole community and in all the different forms, right? More money means more tax money means more ways to help the roads and the schools and all that other stuff.
Yeah, it's
Right.
yeah. There's a lot of direct, indirect impacts,
Yes.
and and affecting various aspects of society, and not just people with disabilities, but as you mentioned earlier, the aging population too, like
Right.
your father.
Yeah.
Um,
No, I mean the aging, and we know that the baby boomers, the largest population, right, that's ever come through the world, um, is now at an age where they are, we call it the silver tsunami, right? Because we're already starting to crest on the tsunami, and they're getting older and they're going to need all sorts of different help. And the good news is with the boomers is that they've only beat to their they've only march to the beat of their own drum, right? Like they're not doing what they just watched their parents go through, right? Their parents, the greatest generation, and then some were, these amazing individuals who were going to suck it up and do whatever, you know what I mean? And that was how they were kind of brought up. But now here comes the boomers going, we're not doing that, and we're not playing that way. And so I have high hopes for the boomers to start thinking about more what that might mean and how our society would look like. Because as you know, like, and being in a manual chair, like, and not easy getting around. It's not easy getting around the city. It's not easy, getting up and over around the curbs or the curb cutouts or in the middle of sends you right into the direct traffic or something like that. I mean, it's just and so again, I do have some high hopes for them. I hope that they step up when they start to realize it, that some of this stuff is just not and has not been working for a very long time.
Yeah. So for the next question, what are some of the design lies or myths society has normalized that you're actively challenging, especially around disability and independence?
Um, industry lies. Well, I don't know if it's necessarily lies, or I can't think of, I mean, one right now. I mean, we have talked a little bit about the idea that people are always trying to get around it, right? They're trying to get around creating inclusivity. They're trying to fill their quota or their promise that they've given to maybe a client and saying, well, of course I can fit in, X amount of patient beds, X amount of tables, and what have you. Um, I think that I find that that's disappointing. In terms of like trauma-informed design, there's still a lot of people out there that are calling it woo-hoo. But we know that a lot of we keep in mind that sustainability was considered a bunch of tree huggers, and now it's all just kind of baked into the cake, and we expect that trauma-informed design will be sort of the new sustainability. Um, and I think finally it's, it doesn't, I think it's the lack of wanting or the lack of trying or, oh, you know what? I know. I know exactly what I want to say here. You know what it is? When people go and they say that they know what they're doing and they don't. They clearly don't. They think they have it all figured out, or in compare, or they are now trying to go along the ADA guidelines, but they haven't done due diligence as to like really what is needed. Um, I did a great podcast with, I think the restaurant has now since closed. But it was in Manhattan and it was run by somebody who was in a manual chair. And he even made sure that things were taken care at the restaurant, like a good seat, good lighting, large print, making sure that there are quiet spaces, making sure there's great access to the bathroom and it's not, part of storage. And and he also provided people with different types of cutlery. And I thought that that was a really, well thought out program. Obviously, he comes at it from a different point of view, but I just thought that that was again, it was just a full program that was thought out. And it does anger me when people think that they kind of put in the bare minimum and they think that, kind of like, well, there, I've done it and I've fulfilled what I need to fulfill. And so I think that that's the parts that get me angry about I guess it's not really, I don't know if it's considered a technical lie, but it's along those lines where people are not doing really work with fidelity.
Yeah, things that could improve.
Yeah.
So, more relevant to your area, how do you hold the tension between wanting to heal through design and media and recognizing that you might hurt someone even with the best of intentions?
You know what? That's actually a really great question. I do panic a lot. I'm always afraid I'm saying the wrong words, right? Like, is Tuesday the same word as it is on Friday? I get it, and so for those that are listening out there, it happens to everybody, but as long as you're upfront and okay with taking that information back and learning from it and apologizing for it and say you won't do it again and you fix it, right? So we did for the Inclusive Designers podcast for, when we put on social media, we had tried using AI as a way to generate a an image, right? So we can have the image being posted there because I don't, even though we do the podcast, I don't put, the interview, uh, even stills or anything like that on there. I usually grab an image. It's usually from whatever they want to give me, and this particular person did not have that. And I got my first like um and I can't remember exactly what the problem was, but they were very angry. It was a person, they were in a wheelchair, it was in a city, it was about urban environments and accessibility, and somebody took real umbrage with the use of AI, and it wasn't representative. And I am deeply sorry. That's all, you know what I mean? We all have to learn, and everybody has different things that they're fully acknowledging. And I guess I just didn't really look at the AI image strongly enough. It looked like what I needed, right? The buildings, somebody in a wheelchair, and I didn't really I didn't kind of take a closer look on that. And so, like I said, we took it down, we found another image, and again, we apologized. It's the best way to approach this. And that includes like people's pronouns and everything like that, and how people want to be identified and acknowledged. And I'm more than happy to say I'm sorry, and I will try my best not to do that ever again.
Yeah. In terms of, we're all continuously learning and getting feedback all the time about best
Everything.
practices
Best
and best
practices.
approaches, as long as there's a pattern of, okay, I'm listening, I'm showing up, and I'm correcting, right?
Right. I,
Um,
I think it's such an important piece, don't you? I mean, I think that that's something that, you know, I just had this conversation not too long ago with my dad, and it was really, because he was getting confused with the pronouns and how does that work? And then, um, and the whole cisgender, all that stuff just goes into very murky water for him. And I said to him, I said, listen, it can get into murky water for me too. Like, and it's new language. Like this was not, something that was discussed. I mean, again, like I said, when I worked at the juvenile delinquent facility, or these juveniles that were incarcerated, like we didn't use the word trauma, right? Like, so it's constantly evolving. And I think we should give people, but unless it's said intentionally and like I'm not changing it, then you can just, you know what I mean? You can leave now. So, but if it's unintentional and you correct yourself and you apologize, because as I said to my dad, I said, I'm going to make mistakes, right? And especially in this line of work, right? I'm going to make mistakes. I apologize for them. I fix it. And I make sure that they know that it was never my intention to do any harm. And thank you for bringing it to my attention because it's important. And and we're all fallible. And like you said, it's everything's just changing very quickly. And it's just a matter of not I don't think anybody really wants to hurt anybody's feelings at the end of the day. Most people. We know who they are, but most people do not want to, you know. And
mhm,
some of it's part of what they knew when they were growing up, right? So that seemed reasonable and normal, and the discussions that were had. Um, and again, it's changing, and I think that that's why there's been a lot of pushback on like DEI and everything like that. It's just simply because it's a little overwhelming. But I mean, at the end of the day, like, come on now, like, like you could also find yourself having your world turned upside down. Your kids can, like, it's just, let's make the world a better place. And, that sounded a little Miss America-y, but like, but I do believe in it and that it's an important piece. And I do believe in most people's goodness and most people wanting to do the right thing. Sometimes when you get called out, you get embarrassed, but you can't get embarrassed, especially in this line of work. Like, okay, I hear you, right? So go back to that conversation. I hear you. I want to be your advocate. I want to be, I want to make the environment, in this case, the best place for you.
Yeah. We're all continuously learning. So this next question is really talking about, we all have our own conditioning, our own fears, our own hypocrisy. And you were talking about emotions, and um, I think people can have those emotions, but then just be sure to not get stuck in them, right? So what have you been unlearning? So the question is, what has this work revealed to you about your own conditioning, fears, and hypocrisy?
That is an excellent question. And I find myself probably maybe once a day going, dear Lord, what were they talking about? Like, because, all right, so I grew up in the, like, I was born in 66, and so my informative years were, the 70s and everything like that. And the world was changing at that point anyways, but I do remember, like, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, like the melting pot of the world, right? Like make no mistake, right? I had friends of all different uh races and religions, and still, you would get home and maybe it wasn't my parents, um, but occasionally you would hear certain, like tropes or like verbiage, going back to that word, going back to that conversation again, and things that they thought that those groups were about. And and there's times where occasionally I find myself, I'll be in something, and or we're talking about, especially in trauma and the language around trauma and everything like that. I don't know if you noticed, I just even a couple of times switched back and forth between incarcerated juveniles and juvenile delinquents, right? Like, I think there's a language thing there that I probably should nail down for conversations like this. But but that was what you also said in the late 80s, right? Like that was how it was presented. So, and then all the stuff that you learn as a kid, and again, being in Brooklyn for Pete's sake, like, I didn't grow up in the middle of the country in some sort of suburb somewhere where, everybody looked like me, everybody went to the same church, you know what I mean? So, but there were still things that were told to me, and I don't think they even resonated with me, or that I thought were, I knew that they were wrong at the time. Does that make any sense? But like, you don't realize how much they stick in you, right? Like, and so then, you're 40 years down the road and you're doing all this work, and then all of a sudden you find yourself thinking, holy smokes, like it's still in there somewhere, right? Like, and again, it goes back to finding some sort of compassion even within myself, and realize that it's a lot of conditioning, right? Like that's just how that works. And it's not right, and that, but it's, you know what I mean? Like it's sometimes it's still there, and it's and I've really found that this work, especially in both cases, both the podcast and the society, I find that like that stuff kind of comes up a lot in that conversation. And, and again, it goes back to finding a little grace, but it's kind of, it's a fascinating question because it does. It's really changed my life quite profoundly. And between you and me and your listeners, like there's definitely people in my life that I've started to cut out because I don't believe in what, you know what I mean? They can't stop themselves. They can't. And I don't think I ever kind of, you know what I mean? Like I was starting to see it anyways. Like it's constant, right? They're constantly marginalizing groups, or they're constantly talking about people in those groups. Like, and that's why they're like that, because this is what that group does. And I have found myself getting less and less tolerant of it. Because there's just no, you know what I mean? Like, what are you doing? Like, we're 2025, you should know better by now. And so, and I'm not talking politics, I am talking clearly about people of different types of groups, and then having people have that, the stereotyping and all that other stuff. I find that I am, like I said, I am a lot less tolerant of it. It's like going to the barista, right? So, so I get on my little soapbox a lot, Ming. I get on my soapbox a lot, if you haven't noticed by now. So,
Thank you for sharing that. So that the next question actually addresses the differences quite well. So it sounds like for you and your personal circle, you're starting to, distance yourself from certain people and certain groups because they have some automatic programming and conditioning that is just hard to undo for them.
absolutely,
And for
absolutely.
whatever reason, that pattern keeps showing up, and you're unwilling to tolerate it any longer.
Yeah, and some of them been friends for eons, like, right? Like, and but now I just think to myself, like, and I wonder, like, I don't even think it's a selfish part on my part. Like, I'm thinking, how does that reflect on me? Like, I am no longer willing to tolerate this baloney. Like, it's not. It's just, and here's, I think the sad part is that some of these people probably think that they're really good people. And, in a lot of respects, they are. We can have two thoughts with people, right? Like the good and the bad, but that constant conversation, or that constant, like, putting people into a box, or putting people into some sort of, like, um, area where they feel like they understand that group because they have had some sort of, like you said, conditioning in order to think that this about them. I don't tolerate at all anymore.
Yeah. So I want to pivot the conversation a little bit, same thing, but pivoting it to the other side of the spectrum, right? Because there will be times that we can distance. There will be times where we need to collaborate in communities we need to be a part of. Um,
Absolutely.
how do you navigate the inevitable moments when wounds or differences surface in those cases? And there are a lot of those cases
I was gonna say, right, exactly,
where
right.
we need to, yeah, coexist, and there's that interdependence going on.
Well, if you haven't noticed by now, I do try to diffuse things with some humor, right? Like that's sort of my first defense mechanism. And then, and saying, maybe, by the way, this or that or what have you. I, I try to, I always joke that I've got a lot of useless information in my head, but I do have a lot of facts and figures in my head, right? Like, so I can usually maybe pull out some sort of study that I've read. I might not be able to tell you who it was written by and what year, but I can go and recite some sort of study that will help to prove my point. So, I think that it's not easy, especially in this particular climate, like, to do that. But I do try to, again, like, I try to diffuse it a little bit with some sort of humor, and I try to, even if I'm typing out an email, I try to put on a smiley face, like, on my face, like, as I'm typing out, right? So that, like, it doesn't come across as, like, I'm going to kick your behind. And, like, right, I have like, that's sort of my go-to, especially on emails. And I try to put that smile on my face while I'm talking to them, because it just reminds me that I'm also trying to come at it not, like the bulldozer I would really like to be. Who knows? Ask me again in 10 years from now, like, if I have any more tolerance left. But I think for the moment, like, that's sort of how I approach it. And again, it's just letting people know. And I think just to have that conversation sometimes. And And take it, don't take, tell, I can tell you until I'm blue in the face. And if that's the case, then that's how that goes. I mean, it's just not, like I said, I was talking about that conversation with my dad, and I could tell he was listening to me, right? And it's, again, it's about having some sort of belief that most people are good and just talking to them about like how to change it. Like I had a friend that used a very old term to describe um, a group of individuals, and it wasn't, I wouldn't call it like, you know, top level, but it was definitely, on the spectrum of like, we don't say that anymore. And you just tell them why, right? Like, it doesn't mean that he's not going to go back to like his buddies who all say that, right? And say it. But maybe, just maybe, if it's in front of me, that it doesn't, it gets a little more watered down. I think that's the best I can try to do. But conflicts so far really within the work, the podcast, as I'm sure you know, like usually I get to pick and choose like who I get to talk to, and I usually have a lot in common with, and I enjoy, right? I enjoy talking to people, and I enjoy having that conversation. Because it's usually people I think are really kind of groovy, right? So, or heroes, right? So that kind of aside, when I talk about more about trauma and trauma informed design, and the work that I do with the society, there's definitely um, usually white men that usually called are architects, and they call this a bunch of woo-hoo, and that is really hard, Ming, not to like, kind of jump across the table, like, so, and pounce on them. And but we tend to stick with the facts, right? To stick with the facts and stick with whatever. And if they're not looking to play ball, I am so convinced on what the work that we're doing on trauma-informed design and with this is society is that they'll come back to us at some point. They're going to have to need to get certified through us in order to do the business that they're looking to do.
So it sounds like with your work, there's a lot of advocacy,
Yeah.
activism, media, messaging. So when your voice is no longer in the room, what principles do you hope will still shape the walls?
That is a wonderful question. Because, I'm getting older, right? I'm going to be 60 next year. So I think about essentially what my legacy might be on, maybe not so much the podcast, maybe that will translate at some point to like getting more followers and having more to have that amplified, and to have maybe even those television shows be produced. But in terms of trauma informed design, I think because I am helping to shape a part of an industry, changing an industry, I do think that I'd like to believe that there will be, somebody out there that will still be like, wasn't that Janet Roche? You know what I mean? So, wasn't that part of her thing? And that it would be baked into the cake, that it is going to be part of design, and you know what I mean? Like we're just going to be doing it, and it's not even going to always have a name for it, right? Like sustainability, it will be taught in school. However, it will also just be part and parcel of how we design. And so maybe it get a little diluted at that point, right? Um, but in terms of principles, I think, we want people to design with fidelity and understanding what trauma is and designing for the occupants that are in it. I think a lot of designers tend to have a bit of an ego. We're really architects, which I'm not probably, I don't know if we want to cut that out later. But I do think that, I think at the end of the day, what I talked about before with my yearbook, that the principle of treating people with dignity and understanding and having conversations with people, right? And getting to know where they're coming from and having everybody finding a place to belong. All the stuff that we've talked about here. I think I'd like to have that. I mean, you didn't use the word legacy, but what kind of principles? But I think that that would be the important parts moving forward and making sure everybody everybody's in everybody's in the playground, right? Like everybody is able to go and have that access. And so it just, it's about justice. It's about making sure that again everyone is heard and that they are part of a community and that there's a sense of belonging. And I think that that helps to alleviate things like loneliness and depression. It's not the end all be all, let's just be sure, but it really helps, right? So,
Yeah, for sure. And thank you so much for being so candid with all these responses and thorough too. And so, if listeners are interested, in your work and they want to get involved or follow, where can they find you and your podcasts and yeah, any of your other?
so the podcast is pretty easy. Inclusive Designers, with an S at the end.com. And we're always open for show ideas, and hopefully we can post this on our website as well, and we'll have links and we do all that rigmarole. And then for Trauma Informed Design Society, you could just shorten it and use the code, or not code words, but like use the initials TID society.com. So TIDsociety.com. And I think I'm at a point where I think you could probably just pop my name in, Janet Roche, Roche, Janet with one N and one T, janetroche.com. Not com, actually, what am I saying? Janet Roche. Just probably pop that in. I'm sure it would pop up. So, but anyways, thank you so much for giving me the platform to talk today. I don't always get to talk about my journey, so thank you.
Of course, and I really appreciate you for coming on. Like I said, you made history on this podcast with the longest response for the first question.
I thought you were going to say the whole thing. I was like, yeah, well, that sounds about right. You know what I mean? When people are like, oh, let's do like maybe a 20-minute presentation, I'm like that's just the opening slide. Come on now. I can be a little verbose, but I can also reel it in when I wanted to. But I was really excited to be here today, Ming. So thank you very much.